Now let's talk about the relative factors that cause demand and supply curves to shift. So far, we've looked at how demand and supply remain static in our model. That is, they don't shift. And exchange rates adjust to bring about an equilibrium value. If, for example, there is a surplus of dollars in the dollar market, the dollar will depreciate, weaken, until equilibrium is achieved. In contrast, if there's a shortage of dollars in the market, then the dollar will appreciate. It will strengthen until that shortage is gone and equilibrium is achieved. We have not talked about actually shifting the supply and demand curves, but it is these shifts that cause a market in equilibrium to disequilibrate. And so we need to understand that, because the larger question would be, once equilibrium is achieved after the foreign exchange rate adjustments, why would we ever leave equilibrium? The answer is markets are dynamic and the curves shift. So we're going to have 5 relative factors that will cause demand and supply curves to shift. Referring back, recall that if we're shifting the demand for dollars, then it must be true that the supply of the foreign currency is shifting. If we're shifting the supply of a foreign currency, then the demand for dollars must be shifting. They always move in tandem. To understand this, we're going to practice an application. And just to mix things up, instead of using pesos and dollars, let's use the Denmark krone and the US dollar. We're going to consider the 5 factors, but we're going to do it in the context of real-world potential events. The first event is GDP, or income, grows in Denmark. To illustrate this, let's go to a model of supply and demand. And if you recall, in a previous lecture, we had the Mexican peso and the US dollar. But here, we're actually going to have the Danish krone. So down here under quantity, it's going to put krone, and then I'll just put dollars here for US dollars. Okay? So the Danish krone quantity, dollars, 2 separate markets. And then we learned before that whatever currency we're looking at, it's denominated in the other currency. For example, the Danish krone is going to be priced as dollars per krone. Okay? Just like if this were bread, it would be dollars per unit of bread. If you're a supplier of bread, you would receive dollars when you supply that bread. If you were a demander of bread, you would pay dollars when you buy that bread. Well, we're not trading bread, we're trading krone. And as a result, it's dollars per krone. If you're a supplier of krone, you're selling krone, you're going to get dollars. If you're a demander of krone, you're buying krone, you're going to pay dollars. For dollars, it's going to be krone per dollar. And then we have our equilibriums here. Now, we could put values on these. In fact, let me look up what the current krone-dollar ratio is. According to Google Currency Converter, the current exchange rate is 0.15 US dollars per krone. So dollars per krone, we put here 0.15. So 15 cents per krone. Well, to get the value for the equilibrium in dollars, you would just find the reciprocal of that. So you would take 1 divided by 0.15, and I get 6.67. Now, in our example here, let me pull this, we have GDP grows in Denmark. So what's going to happen if GDP grows in Denmark? You can start anywhere, but as we go through these, I would recommend that you get a pattern going. So let's go ahead and start with Denmark. Let's start with the market for krone. So if GDP is growing in Denmark, what is that going to do? Is that going to affect the demand for chrome or the supply of chrome? Well, it's going to affect the supply. First of all, the Danes do not control the demand curve for chrome. They don't demand chrome. They have chromes. They're Danish. But they do control the supply curve for chrome. So what's going to happen if their economy grows? There's more GDP, there's more income. They're going to want to buy more goods in Denmark, but they're also going to want to buy more goods from the US and other places in the world. So they're going to actually supply more of their krones to the krone market. So we're going to shift the supply curve to the right from S to S1. Okay? I'll draw an arrow here just to kind of represent what's happening. And a rightward shift is always an increase. So anytime you see a rightward shift, that means there's more. So more supply. And I know it looks like it's going down, and it is, but don't think up and down. Think right and left for now. Okay, so it's a rightward shift, meaning at every price, there is now greater supply of chrome. Why? Because the Danes are wealthier. They're richer. They have more GDP, more income. They want to buy more stuff. And to buy stuff, they got to supply their krones to the krone market. And what does that do over here? It actually leads to a rightward shift, an increase in the demand for dollars. And again, I'll draw an arrow. You see the pattern? The Danes supply more krones to demand more dollars to buy more goods and services in the US. Essentially to import more from the US. Now, once you recognize this change in both markets, you can then find the new equilibrium. We know that the initial equilibrium was where supply and demand intersected, so the new one is going to be where the new supply and demand intersected. And then we can draw our new exchange rate. Now I'm just going to make up a number here, but we know it's less than 0.15. Let's say it's 0.10. You could also draw the horizontal axis, but our goal here is to look at what currencies appreciate and depreciate. Go back to the question. It says, which currencies will appreciate and depreciate? So in this question, we don't really need to worry about the quantity changes. But of course, it's going to be an increase in the quantity traded of krones, and it's going to be here an increase in the quantity traded of dollars. So the krone goes down in value from 0.15 to 0.10. The dollar, the new equilibrium, is going to go from here to here. So the new equilibrium for dollars is going to be here. I'm just going to work off of this. So if it's 0.1 dollars per krone, that is 10 cents for each krone, then that's $10, or that's 10 krone per dollar. Reciprocals. These are reciprocals. These are reciprocals. Okay. And of course, that means the dollar appreciated. So what happens in a market when one country's GDP grows relative to another? Well, the answer is the countries whose GDP is growing sees a depreciation of their currency, whereas the other country sees an appreciation of their currency. As the Danish economy grows and income increases relative to the US, their currency will decrease and ours will appreciate. Now let's do the next one. The next one says inflation rates are higher in the US compared to Denmark. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. Now we have the same markets, right? So we're going to have the market for the krone, the market for dollars. It's going to be dollars per krone, and then we're going to have krone per dollars. And then we can start with the same values. So we had 0.15 or 15 cents per krone, which was 6.67 krone per dollar. We have our initial equilibrium. But now inflation is higher in the US and Denmark. Well, inflation is an increase in the price level in a country. So if inflation rates are higher in the US than Denmark, let's start with the Danes, just like we did before. Again, that pattern. Where are the Danes going to want to shop? are they going to want to shop in a country where inflation rates are higher or in their own country? So what's going to happen is they're going to want to shop at home more and not in the US. Well, what side of this market do they control? We just talked about that, the supply side. So the supply of Krone is actually going to shift to the left. They're going to supply less Krone. So we go from S to S1. But if they supply less Krone, I'll draw an arrow again. Then over here, they control in the dollar market the demand curve. So there's going to be less demand. The demand curve is going to shift to the left from D to D1. The Danes are going to supply less Krones to the Krone market to demand less dollars to the dollar market because they want to buy less stuff in the US because inflation is so much higher than in Denmark. Now let's look at the changes. Actually, before we do that, whenever we're dealing with inflation rates, we have both countries responding. In the previous example here, we saw GDP change in Denmark, but no change in the US. So this is what I would call a one-sided change. Only the Danes responded. They increased their supply of Krones to demand more dollars. We were done. We didn't have to look at how the US responded. But when we're dealing with inflation rates, remember, the Danes are seeing higher inflation in the US relative to their country, but people in the US are seeing higher inflation in the US relative to Denmark, and they're going to respond. So we need to consider how the US responds. Well, in the market for Krones, the US controls the demand side. We can demand Krones. We don't have them. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to want to shop more in Denmark. If inflation is higher in the US, we're going to want to shop more in Denmark. So the demand curve for Krones is going to shift to the right, D1. And that means that over here in the market for dollars, we're going to have to supply more dollars to demand those Krones, supply ones. So supply is going to shift to the right. In other words, we're going to supply more dollars to demand more Krones to buy in a country where inflation is lower, where things are not going up in price as fast. Okay. Notice that we've now moved all four curves. We've considered the response of the Danes. They supply less Krones to demand less dollars, to buy less stuff in the US, and we've considered the response of Americans. We supply more dollars to demand more Krones to shop more in Denmark because it's cheaper. Of course, let's find the new equilibrium. New equilibrium is going to be where S1 intersects D1. It's going to be all the way up here. And again, I'm just going to make up a number, but it's going to be higher than 0.15. So let's go with 0.20. So it's now 20 cents to get a Krone. In essence, the Krone appreciates. And then we go down here to the new equilibrium for dollars. This was the initial. Then we have this one here, S1 and D1 intersect. And that's going to be the reciprocal of this, which if we take 1 and we divide it by 0.15, we're going to get, 1 divided by 0.2. That's 5. So this is going to be 5. So the dollar is going to go down. Now, does this make intuitive sense? If inflation is higher in the US than in Denmark, the value of the Danish krone is going to go up, it's going to appreciate, strengthen, and the value of the dollar is going to go down. It's going to depreciate, it's going to weaken. That should make sense because inflation in a country is actually a weakening of that country's currency in their economy. So if prices are going up in the US, that means the dollars that you have in your pocket are getting you less. But that shows up internationally because those same dollars will get you less krones. And in essence, make not just goods in the US more expensive, but make Danish goods more expensive as well. So hopefully that makes sense.